There is a kind of neighborhood that exists mostly in dreams. Wide driveways, big shade trees, kids' bikes left out on the grass because nobody worries about anybody taking them. Renee Bell had dreamed about a street like that her whole life. And the morning the moving truck pulled up to 14 Magnolia Court, she stood on that perfect green lawn with her husband Marcus and watched their 3 children spill out of the minivan before it had even fully stopped, running, arms out, like they had won something. They had. Marcus was a lieutenant in the Navy, steady, calm, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once. Renee was an ER nurse at the only hospital in town. She had seen the worst nights a person could have and still come home and make pancakes shaped like animals for the kids. They had worked for this street. They had earned it. They didn't think much about the woman across the road. Not at first. She came out onto her porch before the first box hit the driveway. An older woman, gray hair pinned tight, arms folded across a cardigan buttoned all the way to the throat. She didn't wave. She didn't say welcome. She just stood there and watched. And when the movers set the truck's ramp down with a clang, she called across the street that they were blocking the road and she'd be calling somebody about it. Renee remembered looking at Marcus. Marcus looked back at her, and he said, "Quiet, steady. Let's get the couch inside, baby." That was day 1. It did not get better. The woman's name was Margaret, and Margaret complained about everything. She complained when the kids laughed too loud in their own backyard. She complained about the trash cans being out too early, and then too late, in the same week. She called the city about a fence post that sat 6 inches closer to the road than she felt it should. But none of that prepared them for the afternoon with Deshawn. Deshawn was 9 years old, the oldest, the one who asked the most questions and remembered everything you told him. He was the kind of boy who made his bed without being asked, and then came downstairs and asked what else needed doing. That afternoon, Marcus was in the driveway teaching him how to shoot a free throw. Just a father and his son, a basketball and a driveway and a Saturday afternoon. The way fathers and sons have done since there were basketballs. The police came. 2 officers, polite but tired, explaining that a neighbor had called about a disturbance. Marcus stood there with the ball still in his hands, and Deshawn looked up at his father with a question on his face that no 9-year-old should ever have to ask. What did we do wrong? Nothing. They had done nothing wrong. It was the neighbors 2 doors down who finally said it out loud. They came over with a casserole and stayed on the porch a little too long before the wife finally lowered her voice. "I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't," she said. "Margaret, she's never been right about people who don't look like her. It's not you. It's just how she is. It's just how she is." So the Bell family made a decision, the kind of decision that a lot of families like theirs have had to make, quietly, without fanfare, without anyone outside that household ever knowing the weight of it. They decided to disappear. When they came home and saw Margaret on her porch, they pulled straight into the garage and let the door roll down behind them. No eye contact, no confrontation, just gone. It wasn't fair. They knew it wasn't fair. But Marcus had a saying from his years in the service: you don't have to win every fight you're offered. So they didn't fight. They just lived their lives, quietly, carefully, across the street from a woman who wished they weren't there. For almost a year, that's how it went. Then came the cold. One of those rare, hard freezes the town only saw every few winters. 22 degrees before the sun was even fully up, frost stiff on every windshield. The kind of morning that made the world feel brittle. Renee was leaving early for a shift, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, breath fogging in front of her face. She almost didn't see her. Across the street, on Margaret's porch, there was a shape on the ground that didn't belong there. Renee stopped. She squinted through the gray light, and then her stomach dropped, because the shape was Margaret, crumpled near her own front door, not moving. A thin housecoat the only thing between her and the freezing concrete. And here is the part of the story I want you to sit with, because it is the truest part. Renee's first thought was not a kind one. She is human. She had spent almost a year being treated like she didn't belong on her own street. She had watched this woman call the police on her 9-year-old boy for shooting a basketball in his own driveway. And for one cold, bitter second, Renee stood at her car door and thought, I'll call 911. Let somebody else come scrape her up off that porch. It's not my problem. 1 second. That's how long it lasted. Because Renee Bell was a nurse. And a nurse doesn't get to choose who falls down in front of her. She dropped the coffee. It splashed across the frost, and she was already running. Across the street, up the steps, dropping to her knees beside a woman who had never once been kind to her. Margaret, Margaret, can you hear me? A pulse, faint and slow, but there. Skin like ice, lips going the wrong color. Renee had her phone out before she finished the thought. She rattled off the address, her voice flat and clinical the way it got at work. And then the dispatcher said the words that changed everything. Ma'am, with the ice on the roads this morning, you're looking at about 30 minutes for a unit to reach you. 30 minutes, in 22 degrees, on bare concrete. Renee called her husband. Marcus came out of the house in his socks. He didn't ask questions. He took one look at his wife kneeling over the woman who had made their life miserable. And he turned around, ran back inside, and came out with every blanket they owned piled in his arms. 30 minutes, Renee said. She doesn't have 30 minutes out here. We have to get her inside. And here they were, the two of them, lifting a woman who, if she had been awake, might have called the police on them for being on her porch. Marcus got his arms under her. She weighed almost nothing, and together they carried her in through her own front door. What they found stopped them both. The house was warm, lamplight and quilts, photographs in frames on every surface, a throw blanket folded neat over the arm of the sofa, a crossword half finished on the side table with the pencil laid carefully across it. It was a home. A loved, lived-in, carefully tended home. Whatever Margaret was on that porch, in here she was somebody who had kept things nice for a long, long time, maybe for people who used to come visit. Marcus laid her gently on the sofa. Renee tucked the blankets tight, checked her pulse, talked to her low and steady even though Margaret couldn't hear. And while she worked, her eyes caught something on the refrigerator, a phone number, written big and bold in black marker. The way you write a number you need someone to find in a hurry. Renee picked up her phone and dialed it. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? A man's voice, older, cautious. Hi, you don't know me. My name is Renee. I live across the street from your mother. She collapsed on her porch this morning. She's hypothermic. The ambulance is on the way. I thought somebody should know. A long silence on the line, and then the man said, in a voice that had gone tight, I'll come. His name was David, the older son. He was already in the waiting room when they wheeled his mother in. And when he saw her, small under the white blankets, eyes closed, something in his face came apart. He pressed his hand over his mouth and turned away so no one would see. Hours later, when the doctors had her warm and stable, David asked if there was somewhere private he could speak to the nurse who had found his mother. They sat in a small consultation room. Bad chairs, a box of tissues on the table. The first thing David did was thank her. The doctor told me, he said, if she had been out there much longer, he couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. I was just doing my job, Renee said, as a nurse and as a neighbor. And David flinched at the word neighbor. He looked at her a little harder. You live across the street from her, don't you? Renee was quiet for a moment, and then she decided to be honest. She told him, not all of it, not to wound him, but enough. The moving truck, the complaints, the police on the afternoon Deshawn was shooting baskets, the garage door coming down so they wouldn't have to see Margaret on her porch, the whole long, careful dance of a family making themselves small just to keep the peace. David put his face in his hands, and then he told her why. She wasn't always like this, he said. I need you to know that. My mother was warm. She fed the whole street at Christmas. He had a younger brother, the baby of the family, and 2 years ago, that brother had married a woman their mother couldn't accept. A black woman. They had children together, beautiful children, David's niece and nephew, and Margaret had drawn a line she couldn't see past. My brother told her, David said, if you can't love my wife and my kids, then you don't get to be in our lives. And he meant it. He took his family and he left. He swallowed. 2 years. She hasn't seen them. She hasn't held those babies. He looked up at Renee, his eyes wet. I think, God forgive me for saying it, I think she looked across that street at your family and she saw exactly what she had thrown away. And she hated you for it. Renee sat with that for a long moment. That doesn't make right what she did to my children, she finally said. I want to be clear about that. It doesn't make it right. No, David said. It doesn't. I'm not asking you to say it does. And she respected him for that. When they walked out of that little room, there was a man standing at the end of the hall, younger than David, something in his face that looked like it had been carrying a weight for a long time. David went still. And then he said, barely above a whisper, You came. She's my mother, the younger brother said, whatever else she is. Renee stepped back, because this was not her moment. This belonged to these two men and whatever came next between them. But she watched long enough to see David reach out and pull his brother into his arms. And she thought about grace, about how it moves, not in big dramatic gestures, but in the smallest possible moments. A phone number on a refrigerator, a man who answers on the third ring, a younger brother who drives to a hospital for a mother who hurt him deeply because she is still his mother. Margaret survived. She went home to her warm house with its photographs and its half-finished crossword. And something had shifted in her. It didn't happen overnight. Grace rarely does. But the younger brother came back, carefully, slowly, with his wife, and with those 2 children Margaret had never allowed herself to hold. And one afternoon, weeks later, Renee was pulling into her driveway when she heard her name called from across the street. She turned. Margaret was standing on her porch, not with her arms folded, not with that hard set to her face, just standing. I owe you an apology, Margaret said. More than one, but I'll start with one. Renee didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't fine, not entirely. What had happened to Deshawn on that driveway was not fine. What the Bell family had endured for almost a year was not fine. But she walked across that street, and she stood on that porch, and she listened. Because that is what grace looks like when it costs you something. Not pretending the wound never happened. Not rushing to make everything comfortable. Just showing up. Again. I think about Renee Bell a lot. About that 1 second she stood at her car door in the cold and thought, it's not my problem. And then ran anyway. She didn't run because Margaret deserved it. She ran because of who Renee was. Because some people carry grace in them so deeply that even the worst circumstances can't crowd it out. Even a year of being made to feel unwelcome on your own street. Even a 9-year-old boy's face asking a question he should never have had to ask. Grace still showed up, and a woman running across the frost in the dark, and a man coming out of his house in his socks with an arm full of blankets, and a phone call that said, someone should know. And somewhere in all of that, a bitter, lonely woman who had locked herself inside her own worst choices started finding her way back. Not because she deserved it, because grace doesn't work that way. Grace shows up before you deserve it. That's the whole point. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Grace and Second Chances, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who chose to show up even when no one would have blamed them for looking the other way. Because the world gets better, one porch at a time. I'll see you in the next one.